So, according to the Chief Secretary of the Treasury, the buck has been passed on to local authorities to raise council tax. So what lobbying did your department do against the Treasury to say that those pressures should be alleviated through greater allocation of funding from central government?
Well, I've just outlined the extra £5 billion of new grant funding that the Treasury did give. And to be fair, and one of the things that the Treasury and myself and this government did is that we maintained the existing referendum principles from the previous government. And if you look at what's happened over the last decade or so, it's not a shock that council tax rises have happened, and more, I would say, at times have been more challenging for other areas because of the fair funding hasn't been right. So the funding and the allocation of funds, I would say, haven't been right. So we're putting more money into local authorities, but equally we're making sure that the funding is fair, and we're consulting on making sure that those changes do not leave anywhere without the funding to provide for their services. Now, councils will make their own decision, but we've set that preset where it was previously, and we've maintained that because we do not want to see council tax rises for working people, and that's why we've put the money in and kept that break on, which, that one of the Conservative councils was publicly saying that we needed to take that break off, and we've said no, because we obviously don't want to see big rises in council tax for people.
Just on that, and coming back on Lee's point, on that specific point, Secretary of State, is it right and is it fair to say that the spending review doesn't actually include an increase in the core spending power, but it rather cuts it over the long period, because it's the issue of the council tax increases bakes into that overall figure?
Well, in the first 4 years of this government, the government-funded spending power, which does not include council tax, will rise 8% in real terms compared to minus 24% in the first 4 years of the 2015 government. So it's not fair to say that we are not putting more money into councils. We are also listened, and we're giving multi-year settlements, which is something that councils have said they desperately need. We've invested in transformational funding to alleviate some of the pressures, so that councils who are saying, we've got ideas of how we can do things differently, but we haven't got the money because it's going out the door every day on this. We need some pump prime in to then deliver the savings further on. Councils are increasing the amount of money they've got, but the demand, because if we're not fixing some of the challenges they face and the fairer funding formula, unless we do those two things, you can keep throwing loads of money at them, but you're not getting the best value for the money that you're putting in. And councils acknowledge that and say, actually, so if you take children's services, for example, and children's homes, some of the most vulnerable, councils are saying we need some capital and some funding to alleviate some of those challenges we face. We're putting that investment, I think it's 25 million off memory, to deliver on that transformation so that they can provide better services and bring down the costs of those services that are not delivering for people at a local level.
I think the argument in terms of the fairness is by loading it onto council tax, which is a regressive taxation system that relies on data that's more than 30 years old, actually means that it's not based on the ability of, it's not based on someone's ability to pay, it's based on an old value of their house. So I think you could argue actually it's less fair asking for that contribution of core spending power to be topped up through local council tax. But I just want to come on, if I may, Deputy Prime Minister, just on to the dedicated schools grant. And the pressure that that's putting on to local councils. My own council, West Berkshire, is quite small. It's 160,000 people. Last year, £17 million deficit on the high needs block. By the end of 27-28, they project that to be 73 million. And we're probably one of the smallest councils in the country. So, I shudder to think what Birmingham would have to have. And the LGA say that by the end of this financial year, it could be a £5 billion deficit. So could that problem not be solved this year? And when will the government commit to writing that off of councils' balance sheets?
Well, again, you'll have seen that we've extended the phased transition towards a reformed SENS system. We've put at least £760 million through the DFE of transformation fund allocation to reform the current special educational needs and disability SENS system, and over £4.7 billion extra per year for schools through the DFE. And as I say, we've extended the statutory schools, the dedicated schools grant override by 2 years till March 2028. That is the recognition of pump prime in the process of getting, and I want to be really clear, this is about reforming the system to get better outcomes, which will also mean that the costs don't spiral at the rate that they are. And what we're doing is we're listening to what people have said. And I think it's fair, I've been at Prime Minister's Questions every week, I've taken it a few times, and there isn't a week that doesn't go by where a member of Parliament raises a concern about this issue. So we have to grasp the nettle, and we've put significant amount of funding in place now to do that transformation, with the consultees of making sure that people are reassured that this is about our fundamental purpose here is better outcomes for some of the most vulnerable children who are not being served well, and we're spending huge sums of money. So hopefully when we get this right, people will be reassured that their support is in place for people, for their child that needs it, and that we're providing better services, and that councils are at the driving seat of being able to deliver those core services. I mentioned before about children's homes. That is just one example of where vast sums of money is going out of the system and we're not delivering for the most vulnerable children.
And I think we all share that ambition, but there's still the £5 billion of debt to then deal with once you've improved the system going forward. But I think I'll probably use my time up.
I mean, it's just worth saying, kind of like, as well as the sort of fundamental reform of the system, we have said that we recognise the ongoing costs to local authorities, and we'll set out further the plans to address that in the provisional local government finance settlement later in the year.
Because that does have to be front and centre of what you're doing, because the reality is, Deputy Prime Minister's Permanent Sec, without that kicking that into the long grass for another 2 years, a number of local authorities will be presenting to you, to the department, Section 114 notices. That's the reality.
Yeah. I'm acutely aware of what we inherited and the dedicated schools grant statutory override, and the concerns that were very much being sent to me from local authorities in the run-up to the spending review, and the sheer cliff edge that would leave them in. So it is a challenge. I recognise that not all local authorities can deal with that challenge within their own circumstances either. So as Permanent Secretary says, we're very alive to that problem, and we're trying to reform and support and invest in the service at the same time as dealing with the legacy that we've inherited.
That's the legacy you've inherited and you're investing. But going back to the Public Accounts Committee, they said, and I quote, "The Ministry doesn't know if the billions of pounds spent delivering services locally is resulting in better outcomes." What is the Ministry actually doing to rectify and actually address this now? Are we just throwing more money into a leaking pot and it's just coming out the other end? Whether it's on temporary accommodation, whether it's on SEND, whether it's on rough sleeping. These are key areas that local authorities up and down the country are still saying there are pressures. We recognise the 8% you've mentioned, Secretary of State, but 8% from the base of the inheritance that local authorities have seen cut over many years.
So in fairness, Chair, local authorities have already, with incredibly difficult circumstances, have already started to grasp some of this nettle, and there's some really good piloting that has gone on in particular areas. Now, one thing that works for one area, which might be a coastal area or a rural area, might not work for another area, but there's some really good innovation going on. We've put more money, we put 100 million into homelessness additional to help with piloting in 20 areas so that we can deliver a homelessness prevention programme, so that we're getting upstream of some of these issues. Again, in children's services, local authorities have been screaming for the opportunity to change this, and therefore the £760 million that the DFE are putting in and through the Transformation Fund will make a significant difference, so that I think it's fair that local authorities and people that work in the sector, they know what the problems are, they just haven't had the ability and the resources to turn that around, because you can't turn the tap off while you're trying to direct the water another way. So we've now been able to look at a transformational fund to work with them on that, and there is already work that has been ongoing. It's fair to say that where we've got mayors, they've taken particular interest in these areas where it's had a particular impact on them. This is not just a government imperative, it is an imperative for those that are delivering on those frontline services, and therefore the buy-in to create that change is already happening. And the fact that there is a government now that recognises those problems, are sharing in those problems, I think has been welcomed, and I think we'll start to see some real improvements, because as you rightly say, you can't just keep throwing money at it.
And I think it's fair to say you and your ministers recognise that. Do you feel that colleagues in Treasury recognise that?
I think they do, because they've put significant funding in place for transformation. They recognise the challenges that are faced, in particular around some of our frontline services. The pressures have increased post-COVID again. You'll see that in the NHS, for example. We had a target to have 2 million more appointments. We've now reached 4 million more appointments. We're investing in more GPs. That's another example of where the Treasury have recognised a challenge and are investing to save to make sure that we're getting on the right track. But it's also
those are protected departments, whereas obviously you, unfortunately, MHCLG is not. So we get those extra appointments, we get people out of hospital, they don't have homes to go to.
Well, that's why we are investing in homes as well, and the NHS money the health service money has also had an impact on things like adult social care, for example. So more money is going into adult social care. So there's a cross-government working to make sure that we deal with some of the challenges, because the NHS is spending more money on keeping people in hospital on hospital trolleys because we don't have the social care in place. So the work we're doing with the Department for Health is about making sure that we have the home care services and the support in the community to stop people getting to a crisis point, which will ultimately give better outcomes and save money.
Okay.
Treasury recognise that.